Hello, my name is Sarah Martin. I am the online engagement and digital discipleship pastor at Wesley Church in OKC. And today I am going to lead us in a study of Amy Kinney's book, My Body is Not a Prayer Request: Disability Justice in the Church. So I think it's really important to begin by orienting us to my social location as our group facilitator. I am a disabled person leading this study from a disability perspective on a book written by a disabled author, scholar, and activist and professor, Amy Kinney. The word disabled is not a bad word. In fact, it's a word that connects me with a lot of pride and community. I use the word disabled to refer to myself because it connects me with a rich history, a culture, a language, and a community. The work of activism and advocacy from generations of disabled leaders who come before me. To claim disabled as an identity is the work of self-determination and autonomy. It is me choosing the language of how I refer to my body and my lived experience, and it honors the historical choice of disabled activists choosing to refer to ourselves as disabled. As a disabled theologian, pastor, and person, I draw from my own lived experiences and embodied experience, as well as the collective wisdom and history of the disability community. What is a disability, you might ask? Well, according to the legal definition given to us by the Americans with Disabilities Act, a disability is considered a condition that substantially limits one or more daily life activity. In fact, according to the 2010 census, 1 in 4 American adults are disabled, which tells us that disability is a common human experience, a part of the spectrum of how human bodies work, what they look like, and how they move through the world. There are many people who are considered disabled, but may not identify as disabled. And I think that's a really important notion, is to introduce this idea that disability is common, that disability is human, that disability is not an inherently negative human experience. It's just a human experience. And it happens to be one that I have lived for almost 2.5 decades. There is no part of my life in which I have not been a disabled person. I was born with chronic health conditions and disabilities that affect my body, that affect my brain, that affect my process of how I think and how I move in the world. Some people become disabled through injury, accident. They may acquire disability. Another experience that we don't often connect to disability, but is a parallel experience, is aging. If you are not born disabled or become disabled, the time in your life in which you may experience disability is in later adulthood, as your body changes and as the way that your body works and functions and the range of abilities and skills that you have may change. That is a common experience of disability, for example, that often does not get talked about. What I love about Amy Kinney's book is the first chapter deals with this idea of healing. The first chapter is titled Disability Curatives, and Kinney shares an all too common experience that disabled people encounter, whether in secular or religious spaces, but especially in religious spaces, in which a woman approaches Kinney and tells her God told me to pray for you. And here Kenny describes the uncomfortable fact of not knowing quite how to respond to this woman. Kenny writes, "This woman does not know me. She does not have the intimacy that prayer or accountability or sarcasm require. She simply interprets my cane as something that requires fixing and ropes God into her ableism, the belief that disabled people are less valuable or less human than our non-disabled counterparts. Internally, I make a swift calculation. Endure the prayer to avoid squabble, or call her out on her benevolent eugenics and be branded a heretic again." Kenny rightfully points out that the problem lies not with disabled people needing fixing, but rather than the assumption that disabled people are less than fully and wholly human. Kenny writes, "To assume that my disability needs to be erased for me to live an abundant life is disturbing, not only because of what it says about me, but also of what it reveals about people's notion of God. I bear the image of the Alpha and the Omega. My disabled body is a temple for the Holy Spirit. I have the mind of Christ. Maybe we need to be freed not from disability, but from the notion that limits my ability to showcase God's radiance to the church. What we need to be freed from is ableism." I think those are some very powerful words as we think about, like, what does it mean to challenge our assumption about disabled people and about healing. I have often struggled with healing. In fact, as an undergraduate student at Wimberley School of Religion in Oklahoma City University, I wrote my senior capstone on positive healing hermeneutic, or a way of preaching about disability in a positive way that challenges our assumptions about healing narratives. Because I was, as Kenny has rightfully pointed out in this chapter, uncomfortable with some of the assumptions that get made about disabled people needing fixing or curing, or that in order to be whole and human and sanctified, that we have to no longer be disabled. Like, that idea was not freeing or comforting to me, and I didn't know how to make sense of this Jesus who thinks that my body and my existence as a human person needs to be erased. To erase a core part of my identity and my calling just did not sit right with me. And I've kind of changed my opinion about healing over time as I've kind of continued to wrestle with this idea. I think the first part is it's really hard to develop a more inclusive idea of what healing encompasses when you are confronted with just the assumptions that get made. Like, the idea of healing prayer and faith healing makes me very uncomfortable. And in my wrestling, I've kind of come to this recognition, and I think Amy Kenny would be in a very similar vein to me on this idea, this notion. But for me, it's really important that Jesus has this identity as a healer. If we look at the world in which Jesus was living in, the second century Mediterranean world was a world filled with disease, poverty, death. These are a people who are very intimately familiar with being finite beings, beings that have limitation, beings that don't live forever, beings that are aware of their humanness and the fragility of life. Living in this world where life expectancy is much lower because of the conditions they're living in economically, socially because of where the technology is. These are people who would find great comfort and great hope in the Messiah coming with the gift of healing. The 2nd century Mediterranean world also understands healing in a much more broad way than we do in the 21st century world. For Jesus, the act of healing was not strictly limited to an individual act for one person. It was tied to the restoration of an entire community because there was a belief that when someone is missing from the faith community, that it affects the entire fabric of the cosmos, that something is unbalanced in the universe, in that community, because that person is not able to participate fully in life. And that Jesus's act of healing is not only restoration for that individual, but is a transformation of the entire wholeness and well-being of the community, which is a very different idea than I think in the United States, where we have this kind of idea of healing as this very individualistic act, and often is tied to the metabolic, the curing or fixing, the erasure or absence of blemish or disease or illness. That is a very different idea of healing. So I do think that the idea of Jesus healing is a key part of Christian theology and a key part of Jesus's identity. It's also part of Jesus's announcement of the kingdom of God is near, that the work of reign of God is close, and that transformative work is happening. Transformative work is happening. Kenny writes, "This woman uses the prayer card to justify imposing her prejudice on a stranger she assumes despises being disabled. I am not confined to my wheelchair. I have not lost a battle to a disease. I am many things, but a tragic defeat is not one of them." And Kenny's story is one that is particularly common among disabled people, that prayerful perpetrators don't intend to cause us harm, but they have this assumption that disability requires healing and fixing, which is a dehumanizing idea, a dehumanizing concept that fails to celebrate and recognize the personhood, but also the way that the image of God is reflected in that person. We have to challenge this idea that disabled bodies are anything less than holy and sacred, that they have been created by God, and they reflect the divine creativity and the diversity of what human existence can be in its embodiment and its form. Disabled people make up about 25% of the US population. In fact, disabled people are the largest minority in the United States. And yet, we have this framing of disability as something rare or tragic, unfortunate, an uncommon experience, which does not reflect the reality of disabled bodies and disabled experience in the United States. I would like to introduce you to the concept of ableism. So T.L. Lewis, who is a Black scholar and activist, defines ableism as a system that is tied up in the worth and the value that we assign to bodies based on their ability to conform to what is considered normative, expected, their productivity, their excellence, the way they move, the way they speak, the way that they embody. And that anyone who doesn't fit that expectation of what is considered normative is inherently othered. What I think is a really important idea is that disabled bodies reveal God's grace, glory, and intentionality in creating a diverse humanity that just reflects difference and different ways of being, processing, moving, speaking, being in the world. That disability reveals the work of God. I think that is a really important idea, and I would invite us to think that healing is the entire work of the church. That healing is about the wholeness of our communities, that we should feel something in our being as being off, that something is missing. If there are people who can't be part of our community and our life, that we should be bothered by that who is missing because we lack wholeness. Kenny writes, disability acts as a method for revealing the living God to community, not something that always need to be prayed away to showcase God's power. Imagine if prayerful perpetrators approached my wheelchair with reverence and awe instead of condemnation and accusation. And then maybe they would be able to witness the glory of God revealed in my disabled body. Ableism, I believe, is a sin, and it's a grave sin that I believe the church has not adequately reckoned with or challenged. And that isn't what is in need of healing, because disabled bodies are holy and sacred and have been created by God, and we should celebrate disabled bodies. We should celebrate healing as the restoration of someone back to community. That curing and fixing are limited ways of understanding healing. Kenny writes, the goal of healing isn't fixing, but restoring. It's a transformative process that seeks to make someone whole. Healing is not about the erasing of the experience of trauma, which I'm pretty sure is impossible, but about processing it and coming to terms with it, no matter how heavy it might be to carry. And that, I believe, is the work that I have been called to. I believe that one of the reasons God has put a call to ordained ministry on my life is to help people accept their bodies. Because we move through a world where, as we age, as we encounter illness, accident, or injury, our bodies change. And the best way to do that is to make meaning out of our experiences. And there are definitely aspects of disability, of chronic illness that are uncomfortable, that are painful, that there are aspects of my disability that I would not mind healing, but to remove the entirety of my disability from my person would be a loss of my personhood and my wholeness. Like, there would be something missing because this experience is just interconnectedly intertwined with my person and my being. I know no other way of life than living in this body, this disabled body, for the last 2.5 decades. That's the only body, the only brain that I know. Within the disability community, there are different models for understanding disability. And one of the models of disability is known as the social model, which is a belief that disability is a social construct, that people are not disabled because of their embodied difference, but because of the inaccessibility and barriers of the society. Now, there are some limitations to this model. For one, I believe that even if I lived in an accessible society, I would still be disabled because of the way that my condition affects my body, the way it affects my brain, the chemical processes, the structures of my organs. Like, I would still be disabled even if we lived in an accessible society. But what the social model does point us to is that oftentimes it is the attitudes and the inaccessibility, the inability to access and be present in spaces, to have equal opportunity to non-disabled people, that oftentimes that is the most disabling part, not necessarily our bodies. But that disability encompasses this broad constellation, Kenny writes, of bodies, minds, and experiences. So the social construct cannot account for everyone, but it is a helpful framing for naming how the structures we have in place often disable people more than individual bodies. Within the social model of disability, curing or fixing of disability located in the body is unnecessary because it is the social structures of the society or the culture that need restoring and work. Which is an important idea, I think, to challenge this idea that we could actually do something about the inaccessibility that prevents people from being able to be fully present and fully themselves in a space. That is something that we could reflect about, how we ourselves could address the barriers that prevent the full participation of disabled people in the life of the church. Healing is more than a magic trick. Kenny writes, "We are tempted to think a magic trick is what we want, but we wouldn't want to worship a magician. We might pay money to go to a magician's show, or we might follow one on Instagram, but we wouldn't want to dedicate our lives to worshiping one. There are no magic pills, quick fixes, or wish-granting genies when it comes to holistic healing. There's Jesus who wants to be with us, Emmanuel." That healing can become for us this work of wholeness, of ushering in God's presence and shalom to work for the healing of our communities. Rachel Held Evans writes, "There is a difference between curing and healing, and the church is called to healing, the slow and difficult work of healing. We are called to enter into one's pain, to anoint the sick, and stick around, no matter the outcome, even when it makes us uncomfortable." Kenny concludes, "Instead of desperately trying to cure all disabilities, the church should do the slow and difficult work of healing the surrounding society by tearing down spaces, practices, and mindsets that are inaccessible to disabled people, even when those spaces are inside the church itself. The church should follow Jesus by healing instead of curing." And for me, that is the key central principle of my ministry, of my work, that I believe in healing, which sometimes feels ironic considering my uncomfortability with the idea of healing. And it is definitely one that I have wrestled with and struggled with throughout my life. But I know this: I would not want Jesus to heal my disabilities and my chronic illnesses because I believe that there would be a core part of my person, my lived experience, the parts that make me me would be erased, that I would be less if those parts were not part of my human experience and my existence. And for that reason, I celebrate disability. I celebrate being a disabled person. I celebrate the creativity and the way that the disability community has gathered together to celebrate the way that we move through the world, in spite of the difficulty of being disabled, in spite of the assumptions that people make that we claim pride. I love that Kenny concludes each chapter with kind of a snarky suggestion of countering ableism. And she writes the top 10 recommended remedies. Strangers recommend these treatments for my disability. Sleep with a bar of soap. Put garlic in your socks. Get more sun. Avoid the sun. Become a vampire. Never see the sun again. Put a heat lamp on your leg. Put an ice pack on your leg. Bathe with Epsom salts. This will draw the disability out. Take vitamin C, magnesium, or iron, or sometimes all three at once, just for fun. Drink bone broth or pickle juice, but not together, never together. Try to relax. Try jogging. After a while, your legs will remember how to walk. Hit your other leg with a hammer to take your mind off the pain. I hope that we can learn together about disability, whether you are a disabled person or not. I believe that there is much that the church can learn from the disability community as we work and pray for disability justice, because there is no liberation unless there is disability justice, because disability justice affects all of us, whether we are disabled or not. May it be so.